Oh, all right. I'm here with James Duncan, Director of Platform Strategy for Joyent. James, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Doing fine, thanks. So maybe you could just tell me a little bit about what we were chatting about before, which is basically how did you get into the cloud to start with? I think you have some pretty interesting background there.
So, 2001, or going back a little further, 2000, I joined this little company called Fatanga. We were based in London. We did online photo stuff. We ended up getting bought by Canon, and as a consequence, we built a lot of their European web properties. And that ended up with us having a lot of internal infrastructure. We were managing all that infrastructure, and we started to move down the route of managing that in the same way that people are managing Amazon Web Properties now, or Amazon Web Service hosted stuff now. And we'd built all sorts of really interesting technologies, and that evolved into something called Zimki, which was possibly the world's first platform as a service. We launched before Force.com. We launched before EC2, I believe, maybe just after S3. We were certainly developing it before S3 was launched.
And as we talk about this is where Simon Wardley and you met up, who's
Absolutely.
now the head of cloud computing for Canonical and Ubuntu.
Absolutely. Simon and I worked together for the better part of 8 years, always pretty closely. He's a good personal friend as well as being a really smart and clever guy who gets this sort of stuff. But we think along very similar lines in these areas.
Cool. So then what happened with Zimki?
We were probably a little bit too early. We were probably not a great fit for Canon, if we're honest. Unfortunately, the Canon decided that they didn't want to progress with Zimki. I sort of found myself back in Montreal. It's where I grew up, without a job. So I sort of almost became a ski bum for a year. I live up in the mountains. I chop down a tree when I get frustrated. And so I found myself without a job in the Montreal area.
And so then you found yourself getting reasonably smart?
Well, yeah, maybe. I'd like to think so. Like I said, I found myself without a job. I had a few ideas for things I'd like to develop, services I'd like to see. And everyone was talking about Ruby and how wonderful it was. I figured I should find out for myself. So I started to play around with Ruby. I found out it really wasn't for me, and in fact that I missed Zimki. Not necessarily all of Zimki, but I certainly missed being able to build stuff in JavaScript on the server. And while I've been playing with Ruby, I'd sort of taught myself how to use the Git version control system, and what struck me was Git was the perfect way to deploy into a cloud. It was decentralized. It allowed me to push to different servers. It allowed me to clone from one place and push that to another place, et cetera, et cetera. And so with those two thoughts in mind, the idea of being able to develop on the server with JavaScript and with Git as a deployment mechanism, I sort of combined the two things together, and that became a company called Reasonably Smart, which is still JavaScript on the server side, cloud deployment with Git, fundamentally, and from day zero, open source.
And you found yourself, as you mentioned just a little while ago, the darling of OSCON, or was this just last year? Was this?
Yeah. So this was, yeah, it was indeed just last year. It seems like longer ago, to be perfectly honest. I'd known Tim O'Reilly for some time. I sent him an email with what we were up to, and the next day he had his OSCON keynote. It was actually the first OSCON in about 7 years that I hadn't been to. So I'd sent him the email, and of course he picked it up and put it on his keynote slides, which was an honor, to be perfectly honest. It was a great honor. And so the little startup that I put together and spent a couple of weeks doing, all of a sudden was getting all this traffic, and to my great surprise and pleasure, it handled it pretty well. But of course, it was a pretty bad time to start a company.
Okay.
It was a pretty atrocious time to start a company. We had the stock market crash and biggest financial disaster in 100 years, other than the Great Depression. So So not necessarily a great time to try and finance a company, but fortunately for us, in January of this year, Joyent came along and made an offer of acquisition, which we took largely because Joyent really got what we were trying to do. They understood not only the benefits of a platform and the benefits of moving further up the stack, but also the open source aspect and why that was fundamentally important.
Was there a special link between you guys and Joyent? Did one of you work with one of the Joyent guys? Did they read about you at OSCON, or how did they find out about each other?
Circled around the same crowd. Sorry.
Your Freudian slip is showing.
Yeah, we'd circled around the same crowds for a long time, largely because of just that's the nature of the industry. It's still quite small. We never actually sat down, had a conversation until they flew up to visit us in Montreal in early January.
Very cool. So now you've been there for about 6 months now. Is that sound right?
Yeah, I think my first official day as a Joyent employee was probably January 12th.
Wow! Yeah, it is about 6 months. And then talk a little bit about what you're doing now as Director of Platform Strategy for Joyent.
So part of my role is still engineering and thinking about how the smart platform itself goes forward, of which we're going to be launching really shortly. And part of it is sort of just progressing that out to the future. What happens to the cloud in 12 months, 24 months, et cetera, et cetera. It's trying to think about what shape it's going to take. Is this thing called a cloud going to take a form? I think so, and I hope so.
So that begs the question, what do you see in let's say the 24 months as opposed to the year? What do you see coming next year?
Well,
so 2 years, I should say 2 years from now.
It's probably easier to start next year because like all things, it progresses along a path.
Right.
The obvious next things that are going to show up are corporate governance and tools to manage governance so that the service desk in a large enterprise can manage the cloud. That's going to lead to more familiarity with the cloud and more enterprise adoption. That's the obvious next steps. Beyond that, I think you're going to see more platform adoption as opposed to infrastructure adoption. At the moment, when we talk to a cloud provider, in a way, what we're doing is we're calling up the Hoover Dam and asking for a turbine to boil a kettle. That's going to change. We're going to start wanting to boil that kettle just at cost. We can't do that at the moment. And that will naturally lead to more platform adoption. I don't think you're going to see a complete turnaround from machine and infrastructure adoption to platform adoption, but it'll slowly pick up. And that is the next 12 to 24 months, in my view.
And then just to close with, what is the thing that excites you most about the cloud when you get up and go to work every day? Do you work out of your house?
I do.
Okay,
my commute is really short. It's
exactly.
fantastic.
When you put on your bunny slippers and walk upstairs to the office or whatever it is, what gets you most excited?
For me, what gets me excited is not having to care. At the machine level, of course, you do have to care still. You still have to patch machines and make sure your security updates are up to scratch. But for me, it's the ability to have an idea and turn it into software that works really quickly. And not only software that works, but software that works for other people as well. So I can go from an idea to a deployed working application that other people can access in a matter of hours rather than a matter of days. I don't have to wait. Again, I spend a lot of my time with the smart platform, so that for me is what enables that. It's being able to say, git push this lump of software that I've just spent a couple hours writing, and all of a sudden everyone can see it and it'll scale, and that's pretty cool. That's exciting. It gives me, I guess it gives me as a developer the same kind of access to an audience that, let's say, someone writing a blog in WordPress has. It's the push button. Go, it's public, everyone can see it. All of a sudden you're hanging your bits out for judgment.
Excellent. Well, James Duncan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you.